Never mix politics and religion, we are advised. Is that always sound advice? Is the result always that bad? Well, of course, the result will depend on the religion that you're pouring into the mixing bowl. But before you judge whether it's always a bad idea, you might want to know about one time when politics and religion were mixed thoroughly. It was not just any ordinary religion. It was Christianity, but it was no ordinary Christianity. It was a sect of Christianity with a level of individual liberty not seen in the world for many centuries, and which lost its majority status even in the community which mixed them only a generation or two after the mixing. The year was 1620. The mixing was done in the cabin of this ship, the Mayflower. Not literally this ship, this is the Mayflower II, built in 1957. The ship had just crossed the Atlantic Ocean. Many of the signers within a few months would die of cold, hunger, and disease while living on this ship, waiting for cabins to be built on land by men rowing the small boat alongside the ship 1.5 miles to land every morning to go to work. I came to Plymouth, Massachusetts to learn more about the birth of what we in America today call freedom. In this town, one finds the world's experts on exactly what happened in the Mayflower cabin that cold December day. The Pilgrims signed a document which we call the Mayflower Compact. Exactly how significant was this compact?
That was a totally new idea, really, for the English, but it was a very bold step for them to declare. And so the men signed their names to it and signed with their sworn honor. You know, that's part of that signing of the compact.
And one of the things you've been recently teaching about is the Mayflower Compact. Tell us about what is it significant? Is there anything different, unique about that?
Most of us believe, and I believe very strongly, that it is the foundation stone of our Constitution. I feel it was the beginning of democracy in our country.
Okay, and tell me about the Mayflower Compact. What was different about it?
What was different about it was that they were setting up their own laws and they were choosing their own leaders. Now that didn't happen in England. And it would have been considered high treason to have done something like that. So it was very new, very radical. It was a very different way to have a church as well as a state.
The Mayflower Compact, what did it do that no previous document had done?
It's the first written document for self-government in the New World. That's a basis for our Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and many states' constitutions, and it was people banding together to form a government. One vote, one person, and really framed our American lifestyle.
Glenn Cheney, the author of this book.
Hello, everybody. Hello, Des Moines.
Tell me what you know about the significance of that Mayflower Compact.
Mayflower Compact was a very interesting document. It's been called the precursor of the United States Constitution, but that really isn't true.
What do you mean? I want it to be true. I want the Mayflower Compact to be the seed that grew into the Constitution. Who is this guy to mess with what I want? Maybe I should let him explain.
It wasn't specific about how they would govern themselves. It simply said that they would obey the king, and they would, in some unstated way, they would work together to decide what had to be decided. In other words, the king couldn't come in and say, okay, build a school there, collect some taxes for that. They just decided that they would reach agreements. There was nothing about mayors or any kind of government structure. Everyone agreed that they were going to stick together, they were going to honor their debts, and they were going to still continue to be subjects of the king. Interestingly enough, in that they were actually fleeing this king, but they did agree that they were still going to be servants, or not servant, what's the word? Subjects of the king. What's interesting is that they made a decision to be subjects of the king. That may be the most significant part about the compact. People in England didn't decide to be subjects. They were subjects of the king, period. And if they weren't, then they would get bloody well hanged. And these people actually agreed and made a decision to obey the king, which is significant. These people they thought for themselves. That's really why they were, all the separatists, the religious contingent on the boat, they couldn't stand to be told what to do by the hierarchy of the Church of England. They wanted to make their own decisions.
You just heard Glenn Chaney say the Mayflower Compact was not truly a precursor of the Constitution because it contained no details of government structure. Right after you heard Ken Callison say it was the basis of our Constitution. But let's listen to Callison's statement again. He doesn't exactly say it is the Mayflower Compact itself which is the basis for our Constitution. Listen to what he says is the basis.
It's the first written document for self-government in the New World. That's a basis for our Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and many states' constitutions, and it was people banding together to form a government. The one vote, one person, and really framed our American lifestyle.
Self-government is the basis of our Constitution. Not that the details of our Constitution are foreseen in that simple 200-word document, but that simple document enshrined self-government, without which we would never have had the Declaration of Independence or a Constitution, or the freedoms we enjoy today. Self-government does not impose itself upon anyone who had no say in it. Self-government gives every person not only a say, but an equal say. One man, one vote. No single man, no group of men have any more power than anyone else, except to the extent that some are too apathetic to cast their vote or to cast it intelligently.
That's another thing the Pilgrims did. They set up the kind of a town that is governed ultimately by the people. And their vote is what counted on whatever issue it happened to be. And they still operate the same way. There's a town meeting held in Plymouth. And there are town meetings held in many towns in New England still.
There's a huge difference, isn't there, in the level of democracy enjoyed by the Pilgrims as opposed to enjoyed by the commoners back in England?
No. But it's not uncommon for that people elect their local leaders.
So you don't think the Mayflower Compact was a huge milestone in our freedom?
I can speak only for myself. I can't speak for the museum.
How did he get in here?
My own opinion is no. Had Sir Fernando Georges come over, he would be the royal governor. He is the royal governor. He just doesn't come here. So, Sir Fernando Georges comes here. Bradford has no power. No power. John Winthrop comes here. Bradford has no power. He has local power the way a mayor might be.
So the freedom which they enjoyed, free from the crown,
did not occur until 1776.
Well, it was de facto, even though it was not official.
It wasn't. That's why we had a war.
Well, I'm talking about for the first generation or two of Pilgrims. They had de facto freedom for the crown, not because of law, but because the king happened to be absent.
No, that's just not true.
The This man is so negative. A regular nattering nabob of negativity. He won't even admit that the absence of the royal governor gave the Pilgrims the experience of governing themselves, if not the legal right. But you know, I have to tell you something about this man. At the Plymouth Plantation Museum, he is called an interpreter, playing the role of John Billington. And Billington was a troublemaker too. Governor Bradford's wife didn't even think he could read.
I don't know that Billington can read.
I cannot read myself, but
the Pilgrims only put up with him for 10 years before they hung him. Had he really murdered his neighbor, that would be one thing, but some historians think he wasn't even guilty. They hung him because he was always causing trouble. Now, let me see if I can be more careful and keep him out of this otherwise uplifting discussion. But first, mayhap I should address Buddy's contention that Pilgrim elections were nothing new. Well, if you're satisfied that Stalin was elected, then you would be satisfied that the mayor of London was, in those days, elected. The only people allowed to vote were the heads of trade unions. It was like Stalin elected by the Politburo. And by the way, it wasn't a secret ballot, so if you didn't vote the way the king preferred, you would face his wrath. And by the way, there wasn't necessarily more than one candidate to vote for. During the same time, Parliament consisted of a House of Lords and a House of Commons. The House of Lords obviously weren't elected by the people. The House of Commons was elected, but only about 3% of the population was qualified to vote. In order to vote, you had to own property worth at least 40 shillings. Now, the upside of that is if you owned property worth that much in several districts, you had several votes. Not that England was all that bad. Compared with the rest of the world, England was a beacon of liberty. But what the Pilgrims created for us was different than anything the world had seen.
They did have non-church members sign, didn't they?
Yes.
Which was different than the Puritans and different than England.
Yes. And see, there was, a lot of people are familiar with the book, Saints and Sinners. And the Saints and Strangers, excuse me. And the strangers were those that weren't members of the religious group.
Callison's Freudian slip introduces the most remarkable, the most daring, the most unthinkable thing the Pilgrims did. The members of the Separatist congregation did not refer to non-members as sinners, but by the more endearing term, strangers. The Bible uses the word stranger to mean someone not a member of whatever group is discussed, without any connotation of negativity or inferiority. If the subject is the duties of priests, stranger means someone not a priest. If the subject is citizens, stranger means an immigrant. But the Bible is full of compassion for outsiders and respect. Look at this verse, which guarantees the same rights for immigrants as for natural-born citizens. Or this verse, which threatens eternal judgment for not taking in immigrants. This very terminology helps explain why the Separatist Church was so willing to give equal rights to others in an age when every other church in the world seemed to be persecuting non-members.
Now, the Mayflower Compact, who signed it? Was it all the men? Was it just
all the men?
Not just the freemen? Servants too?
I think it was all the men because they wanted to include everybody.
So it was the servants and the people who were the non-church members also.
Yep.
So and that's the thing that was really different than any time before in the last
was a
1,000
new
years.
invention here in America. And it just hadn't happened before. But suddenly there was the birth of a democracy.
Where it was one man, one vote, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Unfortunately, women were left out, but let's face it, the women didn't get the vote until 1920.
Yeah.
Perhaps a couple of boys were left off, but all of the men, the day before they disembarked, signed this one-paragraph statement that they would agree to govern themselves and abide by the decisions that their leaders would make. And that was available to every man on board to sign. Of course, the women and children were not included in that. And there was no test of faith. And this is a very important difference because when the Puritans arrived about 10 years later, and well provisioned and really able to come in and be good colonists, they required that anyone who was to have a vote in civil affairs had to not only be a member of the Puritan congregation, but to have given evidence of a conversion experience. Now, if the Pilgrim colony had required that of not only their faithful group from Leiden, but from the strangers who were part of the company, it never would have happened. They would have disenfranchised more than half of their number before they even got on shore. So that's an important distinction, and I think has been a valuable part of the Pilgrim heritage, that they allowed people of differing opinion to vote and have a voice.
Let's look again at Saints and Strangers, the book that Ken Callison mentioned, to see what Jean Linderman meant when she said,
they would have disenfranchised more than half of their number before they even got on shore.
In Appendix A, we learn how few members of the Pilgrim Church, the Separatists, were on that first voyage of the Mayflower. 17 men, 10 women, 14 children, 41 of the 102 passengers. While the number of strangers was 17 men, 9 women, 14 children, the number of hired hands was 5 men, and the number of indentured servants was 11 men, 1 woman, 6 children. The Saints numbered only 41 of the 102 passengers, and their voting men numbered only 17 out of 50. In other words, the Separatists were glad to give an equal vote to everybody, even knowing their church would always be outvoted. I wonder how many Christians today would be glad to extend rights like that. Page 132 of this book says they even hired a military commander, a very important leader of their community, who never did join their church. Miles Standish. We do not know what faith he professed, if any. I don't know about you, but that makes me want to know what kind of theology drove that kind of openness.
Now, not only did they allow non-church members to vote and to sign that founding document, they also allowed non-freemen, right? Servants. The servants also signed and voted?
Yes. Yes, I think that there were a couple of the very young boys that didn't sign it, but the servant boys that were probably old enough did sign. Okay?
And also, women, they let vote if they were heads of household. Is that right? Like Mary Warren, or Elizabeth Warren?
Later they did that, but for the Mayflower Compact, it was only men on board. And you mentioned Elizabeth Warren. She came in 1623, and of course was one of the longest lived members of the colony in Plymouth. Far outlived her husband, Richard Warren, because he died about 1627. But they did allow women who were heads of households to vote, but that was in the years that followed as they lived out their community.
The Pilgrims were far more free than the Puritans. People don't realize it, but the Pilgrims even had female votes. If the husband had died and the woman was head of household, the woman could vote, which was about 300 years before we legalized it here in the United States.
Notice the Separatists extended to everybody the freedom they found in the Bible without asking anyone to first join their church or agree with their doctrines or even know they had any. This is another foundation stone they gave us upon which our freedoms rest this day. Our nation offers the blessings of freedom to everyone, other than undocumented immigrants and the unborn, without asking anyone to even know if freedom rests on any biblical foundation. I shouldn't read any significance into the Mayflower Compact that isn't there. Having all the men sign a document of self-government, a thing not done for over 1,000 years, was probably just an accident. It probably had nothing to do with philosophy or theology or the Bible or anything conscious or deliberate. It was probably just a navigator's accident. That's it. They were blown off course, forcing them to throw together some kind of agreement which they never would have created if they had more time to think about it. That's it. The freedoms we enjoy today were just a navigator's accident. The Bible had nothing, I repeat, nothing to do with it.
The reason for the Mayflower Compact being written is because where they had landed, it was not governed by nobody. It was not owned by anybody. So they knew that they needed to do something that they could work together in peace and harmony and be productive at the same time.
But they did it because they wanted to hold the community together. You see, when they got to Plymouth, they were actually off course. They had meant to go up the Hudson River, but it was too hard to make that trip. So they wound up in Provincetown, and then, of course, went to Plymouth after that. But people on board, among them were indentured servants, which means you have to work for 7 years and then you get your freedom, and you didn't have to pay for your trip over. But they were saying, well, you know, we don't have a patent, and so when we get off this ship, we're just going to be on our own. And that's why they had the Mayflower Compact, so that it would hold the community together. And all the male people on board signed it, including the indentured servants. And the agreement was that they would abide by the laws of that community.
What's interesting about it is they decided to write the compact when they decided not to settle in Virginia, which is where they were supposed to be settling. They decided to settle north of Virginia, up in the Cape Cod area. And some people thought that since they weren't going to settle where they were supposed to, maybe they didn't have to obey the king anymore. Maybe they didn't have to pay their debts to certain investors in England. And nobody was really quite sure whether they had to stick together. It was quite unclear. And there were some people talking, somewhat mutinously about, we don't know exactly what, but it was decided that they would write, they didn't call it a compact, they called it an agreement and association.
So that settles it then. Just as the human soul evolved from an accidental discharge of static electricity upon some poor unsuspecting protein molecule who was just minding his own business in a scum pond somewhere, the freedoms we enjoy today are merely the accidental discharge of a navigator's peg into the wrong hole. End of story. But hark! Another opinion wafts across the waters.
One of the letters that their pastor back in Leiden sent John Robinson told them that they should arrange before they got on shore to have a body politic so that people could be prepared as to how they were going to govern themselves. That was a totally new idea, really, for the English, who were used to swearing allegiance to the king.
Gadzooks, is there no way to know? Are we to be yanked about by conflicting opinions? Are we not to know the origin of freedom? Was it truly an accident, a navigator's error, or was freedom inspired rather by some sort of pioneering theology based somewhere in the Bible? Why, we can know. The answer is found in this book, which is the history of the Plymouth Plantation by Governor William Bradford. He covers the period from 1608, 12 years before the Mayflower sailed, to 1650, 30 years after. We find that on July 27th, 1620, months before the Mayflower even sailed, Pastor John Robinson wrote to his flock what kind of compact they ought to write. Notice 3 details he specifies when I read it, which were in fact details included in the compact and yet which were unthinkable in any previous government or church, but for which he found precedent in the Bible. First, he writes that no one was to have any more status than any other, no servants or masters, no lesser status for non-church members. A concept right out of Galatians 3:28. There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither bond nor free, there is neither male nor female, for ye are all one in Christ Jesus. Now compare that with Romans 2, verses 14 to 15. Here's a paraphrase. Those who have never heard God's commandments, yet live by them, prove God has written them in their hearts. Second, Robinson writes that they were all to elect their leaders. The separatists were already in the habit of electing their own church leaders, following in the wake of Calvin, whose institutes made a strong case that all church leaders in the Bible were elected. Now, of course, a congregation electing its own leaders was still unthinkable in the Church of England. Third, Pastor Robinson writes that the only governor they had any plans to recognize was the one they elected. Here are Robinson's words. Lastly, whereas you are to become a body politic, administering among yourselves civil government, and are furnished with persons of no special eminence above the rest, from whom you will elect some to the office of government, let your wisdom and godliness appear not only in choosing such persons as will entirely love and promote the common good, but also in yielding them all due honor and obedience in their lawful administrations, not beholding in them the ordinariness of their persons, but God's ordinance for your good. And this duty you can the more willingly perform, because you are at present to have only those for your governors as you yourselves shall choose. Now let's turn a few pages further in this book, page 75, and find out what the basis is for the story that a navigator's error was the reason for the signing of the compact. First, I will turn back a little and begin with the compact or deed drawn up by them before they went ashore to settle, constituting the first foundation of their government. This was occasioned partly by the discontented and mutinous speeches that some of the strangers amongst them had let fall, that when they got ashore they would use their liberty, that none had power to command them, the patent procured being for Virginia and not for New England, which belonged to another company, and which the Virginia company had nothing to do. And further, it was believed by the leading men among the settlers that such a deed drawn up by themselves, considering their present condition, would be as effective as any patent, and in some respects more so. Here it gives the form of the deed. In the name of God, amen. We whose names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of the dread sovereign Lord King James, by the grace of God, of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, King, Defender of the Faith, etc., having undertaken for the glory of God and advancement of the Christian faith and honor of our King and country a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, do by these presents solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and of one another covenant and combine ourselves into a civil body politic for our better ordering and preservation, and the furtherance of the ends aforesaid, and by virtue hereof to enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices from time to time as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general use of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience. In witness whereof, we have here underscribed our names at Cape Cod, 11th of November, in the year of the reign of our sovereign Lord, King James of England, France and Ireland the 18th, and of Scotland the 54th, AD 1620. After the compact was signed, he goes on and says that in these arduous and difficult beginnings, discontent and murmuring arose amongst some, and mutinous speech and bearing in others, but they were soon quelled and overcome by the wisdom, patience, and just and equal administration of things by the governor and the better part, who held faithfully together in the main. So, yes, the navigator's error did partly inspire the Mayflower Compact. But the religious pilgrims, the saints as they call themselves, the separatists as others called them, had already prepared the essential details of the compact before they even sailed. But if that is so, how can it be said that the compact was even partly inspired by the navigator's error? Here's what common sense suggests to me. The separatists certainly needed no accidents to persuade them to follow Pastor Robinson's advice. But remember, there were only 40% of the passengers. The other 60% may not have seen the wisdom of signing a compact like that, which some may have perceived as vaguely treasonous, until after they heard mutinous speeches which threatened to drive them scattered across the bleak December wilderness.
Was it greater freedom than was enjoyed in England?
Yes and no. Most of them were constrained by some zealots on the Christian side. There was a lot greater freedom in the Pilgrims Society than there was in the Puritan Society that came 10 years later. And I go back to Dr. Kober's statement. To me, that is so outstanding, is that North America was founded on search for God, while South America was founded for a search for gold. and that's why we have a lot less trouble up here. As far as, South American countries have revolutions every time they turn around. And really the only thing we've had here since our American Revolution was the Civil War.
In my classrooms, I have them compare the similarities and the differences between the Magna Carta, the Mayflower Compact, and the Constitution. And one of the things that the students and children come up with is that in all three of them, it does mention, under God, or they talk about God, that they're doing this with His permission, if you will.
Do you see any significance between the birth of freedom at that time and the fact that not until a generation before and even a couple of generations after, there was no longer a theology that free, where church leaders were selected by the people,
Yes.
and where all the people had freedom of religious expression through the prophesying services.
This was very new, very radical. It was a very different way to have a church as well as a state.
So you don't think the Mayflower Compact was a huge milestone in
No.
our freedom?
I can speak only for myself. I can't speak for the museum.
Well, I'm talking about for the first generation or two of Pilgrims. They had de facto freedom for the crown, not because of law, but because the king happened to be absent.
No. That's just not true. It's because our colony is brought under the jurisdiction of the Mass Bay Colony. Plymouth, as a separate entity, while it remains a town, ceases to exist as a separate government. Are they still electing a governor, or are they calling him a mayor? Probably, but no different than we enjoy today. we have to follow Massachusetts Commonwealth law.
Well, I'm talking about for the first generation of pilgrims. They had de facto freedom for the crown, not because of law, but because the king happened to be out.
So negative. Billington says the Pilgrims never experienced actual freedom because their freedom was never legally recognized. I submit that there is never a direct correlation between actual freedom and legal recognition of it. Wherever there are laws on the books which are not enforced, we have actual freedom from them without legal recognition of it. In fact, the king had even agreed to give the Pilgrims actual freedom of religion without officially recognizing that he would. Here's the account from Bradford's diary, page 25. Some of the principal officers of the Virginia Company did not doubt that they could obtain the king's grant of liberty of religion, confirmed under his rod seal, but it proved a harder piece of work than they expected. And though many means were used to accomplish it, it proved impossible. They succeeded, however, in sounding His Majesty's mind and found that he would connive at them and not molest them, provided they behaved peaceably. But to allow or tolerate their claim to religious freedom by his public authority under his seal was found to be impossible. Billington also says the Pilgrims were never free because later they were swallowed up by the Puritan government. Just like the city of Plymouth today may have its local government, but is subject to the state laws emanating from the state capital in Boston. All this may make a few years of freedom seem insignificant, certainly not worth filming a documentary about. Except for one thing. The freedom forged in this short-lived crucible is the freedom we enjoy today. The crucible itself was surely smashed, stomped out, swallowed up within a century. But it wasn't the Puritans' theocracy which spread across our nation and from our nation across the world. It wasn't the Church of England established in Jamestown which dictates our religious expression today. It was this unique theology of the Pilgrims that Christians ought to allow liberty of conscience to all men, which found its reflection in our First Amendment. This was no grudging tolerance of sinners so far beneath them. This was no sop thrown to the rabble to quiet them. This was intellectual curiosity so sincere and fresh that they gave all men not just a vote, but a voice. And they even created an institution to prove how sincerely they wanted to hear from everyone, and not just those they agreed with. It was called the prophesying service, and it was held every Sabbath afternoon, after the lunch break, following the morning service.
So they, chose their own leader, and they chose Governor Carver, who was older, a fine man, and he was governor for 2 years, but then he died, and so William Bradford was chosen to be the governor by vote, and he stayed in that office for some 36 years. The elections were annual, and they could have, elected somebody else. But they trusted him, and did the work well, and stayed with it for, as I say, quite a long time, and made it what it became, the beginning of a democracy, which later had its influence in other places because other colonists came and they set up their colonies the same way that the Pilgrims did, and had town meetings, and these were scattered all through New England. And those town meetings were how they governed, and the people had a voice in things.
Like in New Hampshire today?
Oh yeah, in New Hampshire, in every village green, you're going to see a meeting house, and they're still there, and many of them are still used for town meetings. And that's how they made their decisions and everything else. Now, this went on for 150 years.
Can you describe the format of a town meeting for someone who's never heard of such a thing?
Well, a town meeting is just a democratic kind of meeting where anybody can get up and say whatever they think, and then people vote on what's been said, whether they're going to build that highway or whether they're going to set up a school or whatever.
See, in Iowa, we don't have anything like that. The nearest I know is New Hampshire. I've heard that there are such things. But is it anything like a platform discussion committee where they have in Iowa we have the Polk County Republicans come together once every 2 years and have a lot of discussion, except we don't have any binding laws that we pass. But is it similar in structure?
Similar kind of thing.
Huh.
Trying to get a voice that's heard coming from the people, rather than just the people who have been elected and then can make all the decisions. So, yeah, that's similar. And I really think that the spark of democracy was ignited at Plymouth. And then eventually it developed into the federal government. And that's what we have now.
Do you know what the prophesying services were like?
The what services?
The prophesying services on Sabbath afternoons?
Well, Sunday afternoon.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. That was a time when they had an open meeting. It wasn't church. And anybody could talk.
How about the non-church members?
Well, it was open. You didn't have to come. And you didn't have to be a member.
Oh, so the morning service was required, but not the afternoon service?
That's right, but not the afternoon.
Oh.
And then they could say whatever they wanted or whatever they were thinking about anything.
Really?
Yeah, and mostly it had to do with interpretation of Scripture and that kind of thing, and some application to everyday tasks or everyday concerns or whatever. And yeah, it was a way of, again, giving a voice to the people. And Bradford took part in it, others as well, and it was just part of Sunday. Sunday was really a holy day, and it was a different day than any other day of the week. It was all day long. Kind of a devotional thing. And they all took part in it. That was what was done.
Can you tell me about your church?
Well, what do you want to know? Master Brewster is our ruling elder. We have no minister.
How about the people who are not members in your colony?
Those folks that remain in the Church of England that are here. Well, what about them? They need to be better informed of things. Some of them are very sympathetic to our feelings of reform, our wishes for reform, but see not fit to leave the church for whatever reasons. We pray for them, you know.
Why do you not allow them to prophesy?
Well, members of the Church of England not prophesying at service.
I didn't hear you exactly. I don't think any of them really care to. Some of them are...
Many of them can't read.
Yeah, weary of it. I don't know that they are... Did someone tell you here that they would not be allowed to it? Or one of them tell you he was not allowed?
Master Billington complained that
That's the word, complained.
said it with some air of complaint that no one asked him to prophesy.
Oh, well, it's not a matter of not allowing, I don't think. Although, were he to speak to Master Brewster about it, I don't know what the response would be, truly.
I don't know that Billington can read, and oft times when men are prophesying, they are reading from the Scripture. There's certainly more to it than that. They might be explaining it or questioning it or elaborating, but they oft times are reading from the Scripture, not just reciting it.
Well, would you explain the process? I came from a very strange church where no one is allowed to speak other than one man. And so this idea of other people prophesying is a strange idea. Can you explain how it works?
Chiefly in the afternoon, after we break for dinner, we all gather again. Oftentimes in the first floor of our fortress, where we gather as a church and hold our services there. So, well, I think you should probably speak to a man more on this, being that women don't speak in service. But certainly if you wish to discuss a matter of scripture or a specific passage that you has come to vex you, or perhaps has come to new light in your mind or in your heart, then you can bring that forth. There will be some discussion, may have questions asked. It's quite different than I think. It's not done in other churches.
No, it's not done in the English church either, so the minister is the only curate, is the only man to speak.
So if someone wants to bring forth such an idea or shares an idea, does he just stand and then is recognized?
Yeah. Well,
speak up, really. They just speak up. I'd like to speak now.
I think...
And you're recognized by them.
I think some of them may speak to Master Brewster about it before time, but I don't know if all of them do. I'm not certain of that.
But everyone can be heard if you wish to be, And then on Thursdays there's a lesson as well. The chiefer men, well, anyone I think really is invited, but oftentimes it's the chiefer men of the town, and have a lesson at Master Brewster, his house. Oftentimes on scripture, perhaps elaborating on what has been preached upon at the service, or mayhaps as a lesson before that service is preached upon on the Sabbath. So,
do you have any idea how long this practice will
how can you know the future?
Exist? Yeah.
How can you know the future? No, we don't know.
I think it would continue some time, except well, we have no pastor anymore. I'd like to have a minister here, but some were... I believe there is good ground for scripture in it, but if there were some to find some argument in scripture against it...
Is there... against having a preacher, you mean?
No, prophesying. Oh. That was your question, was it not? About how long it might continue?
Yeah.
But I believe there is good ground for it.
Even the idea of having a minister, is that a unanimous desire among the colonists?
I would think so, yeah. We can't see why anyone
would
not wish to have it.
We can't enjoy any of the sacraments. Our children are not baptized. We have not recently.
Since we've been here, and yet we used to have it every Sunday, and baptizing as often as there were children to baptize.
How about the prophesying service? Do you participate there?
I have. It's, when you say participate, it's a different sort of service. It's wherein a man might speak if his conscience moveth him to do so. It's not, and that part is not rightly required by law, certainly. A man who has gone to the forenoon exercise hath done his duty by the law, and yet, yeah, I find it quite inspiring, and well, I've little better to do, really. It's on an afternoon tomorrow. But for your part, I don't mean to say you'll be required to stay through the whole day of it. And yeah, you'll be welcome to it, I think. Yeah.
My question was, did non-church members have freedom of speech in the separatist prophesying services? They did in the Corinthian church services, which the separatists took for their model. But today the question seems obscure. I wanted to double-check my reading of the separatists' pastor by the understanding of these scholars at Plymouth Plantation. I admire the wit of these reenactors to get so in character that visitors can talk with them as freely as if they were in a time machine talking to the original pilgrims. Here, the reenactor of Will Wright probably doesn't know the answer to my question, but he remains in character with such wit that his response is just as entertaining.
What I was saying, I attend, we all must. It's the law here, same as in England, of course. Each man must attend the service, and women. And that just be the nature of it. You got to go to the service, and then it's an all-day thing, here. And 7 hours. The minister, he's a learned man. He is Elder Brewster. He's the one that gives the service.
Sure.
He can give a sermon in 3 hours easy. He's done after 3 hours. Okay. Well, that's a bit of a skill too, ain't it? You have to sit there like you're listening the whole 3 hours, and you might not. Then you got to learn that. You see.
Master Billington made the distinction between people who are members who get to prophesy at the prophesying service and those who are not members who don't.
Well,
he said he's never been invited to prophesy.
That John Billington, how you tell you something? There's best times where you not say all that you're thinking, whether it's true or not. I think you keep some of them things to yourself, eh? What's the point of it? They run a fair ship here, and that be the main thing about it.
So, but is there a membership that if you're not a member you can't prophesy?
Master, you're trying to get me involved in something I don't want to get involved with. I don't know how to tell you that, but I'd rather leave it all alone, you see. Whether you're a member, whether you believe they're sincere, they do the proper thing by you. Right? They're at peace with the natives. I can't say no other place has been fared so well with the naturals as what they have here. So I go along with whatever they say.
Okay.
I'm not going to find fault when the little things. You run down there and say, well, Will Wright says, I'm not a hottie peak. I'm not Dick Whittington, mind you, but I'm no
What's
dolt.
the first thing you said? You're not a what?
A hottie peak.
A hottie peak? Is that like a hothead?
A dolt.
Oh.
I'm not an idiot. All right?
Can I ask you do you get to prophesy?
Well, that's just what I'm saying, isn't it? You're on that thing there, and I don't want to. I want to walk right around that, and you'll continue to take me right back to it. I don't think I will answer that. Not that I'm not trusting you, but you just come up here and told me what John Billington said. You might run down here and tell him what I said. Then where would we be, eh?
Maybe what Will Wright is telling us is that he doesn't know because while everybody was prophesying, he was asleep.
Are there Christian churches today that do the prophesying in the manner of the pilgrims? Now, a typical Sunday for people in the pilgrim community was to gather at 8 o'clock for worship, which we did last week, and then after a lengthy sermon and probably at least 2 hours, maybe more, spent together in the morning, then they'd break for lunch. Everybody would bring a basket lunch, and then in the afternoon they would prophesy. So they would spend all afternoon. And any of us who have been in any kind of close group or encounter groups that were popular a number of years ago, or support groups that we have many of today, would inherit this dynamic of being very truthful to one another and being corrected. I mean, if you said something that wasn't quite right, people would disagree with you publicly, and it would get hashed out within the congregation. Now, that's still going on in our Christian churches today, but not in quite the same formal sense. I made a little joke on Sunday morning saying that, well, we were going to get together for an afternoon meeting, that our opening ceremonies would start at 2 o'clock, and that perhaps we would be prophesying to one another, but not at all in the way that it would have been done in Plymouth. In Plymouth, it would have been a very severe examination of conscience and shared in front of, that would take a lot of courage to stand up in front of your closest friends and neighbors and confess what you'd done wrong. or tell somebody else what they had done wrong. But that kind of truth-telling and search for wisdom was really the focus of this prophesying. And in ways, we still do that in our churches. Now, you know, the Quaker service will be silent except when someone feels the Spirit is pushing them to get up and talk, and then they will. But it's also true that occasionally the Spirit will encourage someone else in the room to get up and tell the first guy that he's talked too long or that he's off base or whatever. So that tradition of truth telling and truth sharing is a part of our pilgrim heritage, but I think it's found in a number of churches. I think your charismatic churches in our day and age have been doing that kind of prophesying. But I would interpret prophesying in the sense of telling the truth as you understand it and making what you believe known to your fellow members. And that was not an easy thing to do, you know. But there is this thread that comes all the way down through many churches. There seems always to be a recognized need to be able to share openly with the people within your faith community, but we do it in different ways.
Like, for example, if you've been studying a passage and you're really inspired by it and you just bursting to share, I don't know of a church in Des Moines where you can do that. The pastor's got his sermon notes all prepared, and the Sunday school's got their class literature that's been figured out for the last 12 weeks. But it sounds like in the prophesying service that would be the natural.
It would be natural, but you can imagine if you try to do it in your congregation today and you don't think it would be welcome, then you know it takes a lot of courage to speak up. But they gave permission, at least to the men, to speak truthfully and to correct each other. So it was really an encounter group of a very intense nature. But almost that's what they needed to be able to do in order to survive in a totally new environment that was not particularly friendly. And when you read of the terrible loss of life in their first year, which would have destroyed a lot of groups, but didn't finally destroy them, part of their strength came from being able to be witnesses to the truth and being willing to be corrected if somebody else didn't agree with them.
Indeed, Pastor Robinson expected respectful disputes as part of the process of prophesying. In our prophesying service, we are briefly to speak a word of exhortation as God enableth, and questions also about things preached, and with them even disputations, as there's occasion, being part of that exercise. Here he lists the benefits of such discussion. We could more easily ignore his list if he didn't follow it with scripture showing that very same kind of animated discourse was the habit of Jesus, Paul, and Apollos. We all prophesy to each other so that things doubtful arising in teaching may be cleared, things obscure opened, things erroneous refuted, and lastly, that as by the beating together of two stones fire appeareth, so may the light of the truth more clearly shine by disputations, questions, and answers modestly had and made.
And it's true that democracy makes nations strong. For example, our nation here seems to be stronger militarily than the whole rest of the world, and yet that doesn't create any necessity that people must be free. And in fact, over the centuries, people and civilizations would rather just die out than think of such a thing as letting low people have the rights of high people, but they chose to be free.
Well, and I would say about the Pilgrim community, the Leiden congregation, they were self-chosen. Now that's the other thing. I don't think you just walked in and joined their church. I think you had to be examined pretty closely before they would admit you. They had to do that because they were being spied on all the time. And they knew that if they let someone in who was a spy, they would all end up in jail before the next week was out. So they had to be very selective. And I think this prophesying was another mechanism for keeping everybody on their toes and as accurate in their pronunciations.
Did an obscure theology of freedom, which holds little interest among Christians today, give birth to the freedom of speech and freedom of religion, which is the glory of what we call Western civilization? This is not a politically correct theory, and we should expect it to meet resistance. Well, I would sure like to know what the theological discussions were about prophesying back then. I know from 1 Corinthians 14 is where I find the term used as being part of a church service, and there it says, "Let two or three prophets, let the prophets go 2 or 3, and let the other judge," as if to describe a modern panel discussion. But even with these restrictions, even if they would not hear a heretic, who's a heretic in their opinion, still it seems to me that there was this window of religious freedom, of religious expression, which did not exist very much before the Pilgrims, and which did not exist, was not the majority opinion very much after the landing, and that during this brief window of time is when we found our first successful and stable government in this new world, and which happens to be founded on the same kind of people selecting their leaders and having freedom of political expression.
Is there a question?
Yeah, what do you think?
I think it's difficult to assign too much importance on a brief period of time. I think things are important to us about this period of time because they have been. I don't know that there was that much important mind to it at the time. I think it's easy for us to look back in hindsight and say, this is what all this stuff meant.
I would agree with you that I would not expect the people of the time to have expected that convergence to have endured for 400 years.
Yeah. I don't know that it has. I mean, I think that's what I mean by we tend to put a sense of importance on things. I'm always hesitant to do that as a historian because much of what we try to do here is show people that what they believe about this time period and about these people and the events of their time. We've come to give it a sense of importance that I don't particularly think exists.
The logical connection that jumps out to me is that had the Pilgrims accepted these popish rags, as they're called, the hierarchy of the church that was beyond the approval of the members, and had they still been inclined to burn heretics at the stake, I don't see how they could possibly have. I don't see how civil freedom could possibly have occurred to them. But
you mean in a Revolutionary War sense, apart from the crown?
Yeah. But because of the fact that they had accustomed themselves to this degree of freedom in their theology, it seemed natural for them to occur to them to say, "Oh, let's set up our civil government that way too."
I don't think so, because I don't think the idea that I think particularly once they came and once other people started coming, they are a very small little group in Holland, and they have to, out of necessity and desire, remain tightly knit. They're strangers in a strange land, and we know ourselves. We only trust ourselves. And then they come here, and they're suddenly thrust amongst a much divergent sort of attitude. You know, they know the attitude. It's Church of England people, and it's Puritan people. So it's not that they're unfamiliar with it. But then as more and more people come, I'm
kin of Richard Warren.
Really?
Yeah.
He came across here when I did. Hey.
he is, I suppose you might say, the genesis of my arrival here in some respects. He is the first man that I heard about the venture from. He had read, I cannot read myself, but he had read a broadsheet and gave me news of it. The bottom line is what happens is we stop having peace with the natives because there's many, many, many more of us coming. And we do take their land. And then our community here ceases to be. They spread out immediately. Miles Standish goes to Duxbury and lives over there. Peter Brown goes to found Eastham on Cape Cod. So they disperse. There is a diaspora of these people, and Bradford sees this happening, and that's, I think, when he decides, I'm done with being governor, because he's governor a long time, and then Winslow becomes governor, and he becomes governor again, and as after the reason why we portray 1627 is that's the linchpin. After that, things change dramatically. Edward, what's his name? Edward? No, Mr. Fuller goes up to the Mass Bay, and I think, or up to what's now Salem, Namkeg, and gets some contagious disease and brings it back and kills a third of the population. You know, in 1630. My character is hung for murder.
Oh.
Yeah. John Billington shoots a man for trespassing on his property and is hung for it. The first Englishman hung him.
When did that happen?
1630.
Wow.
3 years after yesterday.
Wow.
Yeah. So, I mean, all these things are awkward to portray, you know, because people always want to tell you your future.
In a world in which only a tiny percentage of citizens were allowed to vote, the separatists gave the vote to every man and to every woman head of household. In a world where no man had freedom of speech to criticize his political or religious leaders, the separatists created freedom to criticize both. The separatists gave even their theological opponents a vote and a voice even to criticize and correct both church and state without punishment. The separatists even encouraged robust freedom of speech by instituting Sunday afternoon prophesying services, from which are descended town meetings which persist today in that corner of the United States. The separatists did not, like other Christian denominations then and some today, marginalize and dehumanize critics of their doctrines, carefully pre-screening every idea allowed on the podium for anything slightly nonconformist or controversial. The separatists not only declined to torture outsiders, they treated them as respectfully as insiders. The separatists created the first model in over 1,000 years of self-government which did not impose itself on anyone who had no say in it. The separatists were not forced to give outsiders a break because outsiders were the majority. Tyrants were never before afraid to oppress the masses. The separatists were not tricked into being outnumbered. They planned to take with them more than their own number. The separatists shared freedom as freely as we do today, without requiring that anyone agree with or even know about freedom's philosophical or theological foundations. The separatists tolerated dissent sensibly. They created a forum that welcomed all voices to speak openly, where error could be corrected through respectful discussion. It is time for an important question. Is all this history entertaining at most? Is it but a curiosity from the past? Or was there, in that pilgrim model, any freedom we have lost worth regaining today? Could it be that the theology which created our freedom still has the power to restore and preserve our freedom? The separatists mixed politics and religion thoroughly, a thing which we today profess never should be done. The separatists invited all to express the highest principles they knew in those forums in which they decided whether to protect good and criminalize evil, or the other way around. The separatists understood that public discussion of what is good enough to be protected by law and evil enough to be punished by law needs freedom for citizens to appeal to the highest principles they know. Do we have that much freedom today? Do we want it? Lord, I'll bear the toil, endure the pain, supported by thy word. Am I a soldier of the cross, a follower of the Lamb? And shall I fear to own his cause, or blush to speak his name?